All righty. Good morning. Is this working? Welcome to day 3 of Genocide Awareness Week. This is a week-long event seeking to address how we, as a global society, confront violent actions and current and ongoing threats of genocide and related mass atrocity crimes throughout the world, while also looking to the past for guidance and to honor those affected by genocide. We are grateful to the Rosenbluth Family Charitable Foundation for their generosity in sponsoring this educational opportunity. My name is Judy Searle. I am the daughter of Sally and Barry Rosenblum and granddaughter of Raphael Minarski, all of whom were Holocaust survivors. May their memories be for a blessing. As a former president of the Phoenix Holocaust Association and as a member of the GAW Community Advisory Board, and having been born and raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, from where our speaker has traveled, I am honored to introduce our first speaker of the day. Dr. Andrew Wolford is a professor of sociology and criminology at the University of Manitoba and former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. He is the author of This Benevolent Experiment, Indigenous Boarding Schools, Genocide and Redress in the United States and Canada. The Politics of Restorative Justice, Between Justice and Certainty, Treaty Making in British Columbia. He is co-editor of Did You See Us? Reunion, Remembrance, and Reclamation at an Urban Indian Residential School, Canada on Colonial Genocide, The Idea of a Human Rights Museum, and Colonial Genocide in Indigenous North America. Please welcome Dr. Wolford.
Thank you. I just got to get my display up. Make sure. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be part of Genocide Awareness Week. Once again, I think I was last here in 2016. I want to begin by acknowledging the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries, and to acknowledge that Arizona State's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on the ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Yakima, Udam, and Peepash Indigenous communities whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. I want to focus on this. This is the university's acknowledgement statement, in part because it emphasizes this idea of stewardship, and I'm going to come back to that in my talk today. I'm going to be speaking about Canada and the Anishinaabe and Nahiwa communities in particular, mostly Anishinaabe, but this notion of stewardship is going to be a key component of the way in which I'm going to ask us to think about genocide in my talk. I want to also start by noting that I'm a non-Indigenous scholar, and I started down the path of studying this topic of settler colonial genocide, in part by working on another project. Judy mentioned my book, Between Justice and Certainty, which is a product of my PhD dissertation, where I was looking at treaty making in British Columbia, my home province. And when I would go and interview elders and chiefs as part of that project, before they would talk about treaty making, they would say, first, I have to tell you about the genocide. And this happened on more than one occasion. So I wanted to honor that because I saw them not as using this in a polemical or rhetorical fashion. They felt this is the term that best described the world devastating consequences of settler colonialism for their communities. So a lot of my work then focuses on trying to draw on Indigenous thinkers, Indigenous elders, and the ways in which they understand their groups, and to use that as a lens for genocide studies, rather than simply pulling from the genocide studies canon to study Indigenous peoples, to try to reverse that relationship. As a non-Indigenous scholar, I'm not always a perfect translator, but this is part of the project I've laid out for myself. So my presentation today is going to focus on Canada's Indian residential school system and the techniques of cultural destruction enacted through the system, especially as these techniques interfered with Indigenous relationships with water. The residential school system also engaged in acts of physical and biological destruction. I'm not suggesting it was just cultural destruction. Certainly, some of you may have heard about the bodies of Indigenous children found in unmarked graves at several schools over the past year, or maybe about the elders, survivors, and chiefs who went and had an audience with the Pope recently to discuss the Catholic Church's history in running these schools. The primary objective, I'll argue, of these institutions was to erase Indigenous cultures so that there would no longer be Indigenous peoples, and so that settler Canada could have unrestricted access to the land and resource wealth of this part of Turtle Island. The system shared many similarities with the American Indian boarding school system, as well as some differences. I won't address those today, but I'm happy to speak about them in the question period. For today, I want to focus on one specific aspect of cultural destruction, the way these schools sought to recalibrate Indigenous relationships to the natural world. To dispossess Indigenous peoples of the resource wealth of what is now Canada, the settler government, along with the churches that ran Canadian residential schools, had to disrupt Indigenous stewardship, there's that word, and connections to the land, water, and other animals. So I'm going to focus on the Anishinaabe community. You can see in the map here, Anishinaabe territory stretches from parts of Saskatchewan through my home province of Manitoba into Ontario and a little bit of Quebec, as well as through several American states. Anishinaabe cosmology, in Anishinaabe cosmology, agency is widely distributed among human and more than human entities. By more than human, I mean anything that is not human, from animals, plants, water, to the spirit world, so on and so forth. These are all entities that comprise creation. So for them, the world is a vibrant and entangled place. So I want to single out water as a primary co-constituent of Anishinaabe life, by which I mean waters and Anishinaabe people make their world together. I'm going to introduce the concept of symbiogenetic destruction and how it relates to the concept of genocide, and provide some background on the broader research project out of which this presentation is drawn. And I'll follow this with some testimony from survivors of residential schools, showing the ways in which water came up in their remembrances of life before residential school, during, and after. So with that, let's get started with the first slide here. I don't see it on my screen, but it's up there, so that's good. So symbiogenesis basically means, or symbiogenetic destruction is a term we use to refer to this destruction of symbiogenesis, which is the process of becoming together. My two PhD students, whose names are on the slide there, and I have been using this term not to provide a new definition of genocide, a new term to replace genocide, but rather as a way to focus in on one particular stake of genocide, one consequence of genocide, the ways in which genocide destroys people's relationships to the world around them. And in making this term, we draw on several theoretical perspectives that I'm not going to spend any time on right now. These include Indigenous studies, the new materialisms, the ontological turn in anthropology, post-anthropocentrism, and animal studies. Next slide, okay. What these perspectives share is a suspicion of this modernist binary between culture and nature. Some of this draws on the work of Bruno Latour, who in his book, We Have Never Been Modern, suggested that a construction happened in European history where we decided that culture was somehow separate from nature, that these were two different fields, two different areas of research, two different areas of interest. But in truth, they're entangled. We see hybrids of culture and nature throughout our day-to-day lives. We don't have to think about anything more than COVID-19 to understand how this works. COVID-19 refers to a virus, but this virus is transmitted through social networks, through our cultural lives. So we can't think about it without thinking about it in these hybridic terms. This would be Latour's argument, but something that all these perspectives share. Further, they share a sense that we need to move away from human-centered frameworks in which only humans act and only humans matter. So this can be seen as particularly challenging for genocide studies, which of course is a humanistic discipline based upon human groups. So we're going to try to expand the realm of genocide studies a bit to bring in the more than human. So that involves some key assumptions. First off, we begin our work by considering the group as the entity that genocide studies is most concerned with. Building off the work of Raphael Lemkin, we see the genocide keyword as being created to address a crime against groups as collective entities. And as good sociologists, we've all learned our Durkheim. We also think that the group is more than just a sum of its parts. So the group is more than just an assemblage of individuals. The group is something that gains a life of its own through the cultural networks through which group members make their lives meaningful, and through which they constantly are in this process of becoming, constructing themselves, constituting themselves as collective actors. So this doesn't just involve the human actors as part of the group, it also involves all that surrounds them. The land, the waters, other animal species. It also connects with, the spiritual world, as well as various human-made pieces of architecture, art, and other things. We're constantly in interaction, or some would say interaction, but I won't get into that terminology, with the more than human world in constituting ourselves. And often these other entities play an active role in the creation of our group selves. I won't get too much into the concept of ecocide versus genocide here. Other scholars have been working on this lately, the connection between ecocide and genocide, but it should be clear from what I'm saying that we don't see these as two separate concepts, but as entangled. The broader project this is on begins at the Forks of Winnipeg, begins with Anishinaabe and Cree communities, and then ventures out into the genocide studies canon. As I said, we wanted to look at what can be learned about these other sort of canonical cases of genocide through the study of Indigenous genocides specifically. So our other research sites include Armenia and the relationship to Mount Ararat, as well as to the land and territories, particularly of Western Armenia. Relationships with cattle amongst the Banyarwandan people in Rwanda. In Cambodia, we looked at relationships with rice as they related to the Cambodian genocide. And then finally, Canada, in Manitoba, Anishinaabe and Cree peoples, and water. And at each site, we're focusing primarily on testimony from survivors and the ways in which they mention their relationships with their key symbiont, their fellow co-constituent in collective life, their non-human co-constituent. We look at the ways in which they talk about these entities before the genocide, during, and after in the process of healing and injustice. So we can talk about more of that later. I'm going to now get into my main topic before I use up all my time. Nelson refers to the Anishinaabe as water people, recognizing the centrality of water to their identity. In the Anishinaabe language, the word for water is nibi, and it refers to all types of water, not just water singular, but water plural. Nibi is a living entity and also a giver of life. It's respected as a being in its own right and as a relation on whom humans and many other beings depend. And Nibi is sacred. You can see in Kim Anderson and her co-author's quote here. They say, water is not only understood to be alive in many Aboriginal cultures, but also sentient, having consciousness. Because it is spirit or carries spirit, water is capable of establishing relationships with other life forms. Women in particular have a specific role in relation to water. Joanne Lawless and her co-authors write, quote, as with the human body, the body of Mother Earth is comprised mostly of water. Waters that represent her veins and the waters she uses to fulfill life-giving cycles, abilities, and responsibilities. So women have a special role as water carriers, as knowledge keepers about water within Anishinaabe communities. Now, given the importance of water in Indigenous societies, particularly the Anishinaabe world, it's a cruel reality that so many Indigenous communities lack access to safe and clean drinking water. Hanrahan notes Indigenous persons are 90 times more likely than other Canadians to lack piped water. We know there's similar stats in the United States in terms of lack of access to clean and safe drinking water for Indigenous communities here as well. This is a part of a broader process of colonial capitalist water dispossession, whereby resource extraction, power generation, and industrial runoff and urban pollution have deprived Indigenous peoples of their relationships with water and placed them at greater risk of illness. But I'm going to suggest that this begins not just through industrial expansion into Indigenous territories, it also is part of the residential schooling process in Canada. Now, for those who aren't familiar, the Canadian residential school system operated on the rationale that Indigenous parents were too stubborn, too backward to transmit to their children the lessons of colonization. However, they saw the children as more pliable, and therefore they were targeted as the ones for assimilation, as it was called. This, started sporadically in the, going back to 1600s, but more sporadically in the 1800s until about the 1880s, when the Indian residential school system received state report and became more expansively used across Canada. The residential school system removed children from their home communities at ages as young as 4 or 5. It operated until the last school closed in 1997. And these carceral schools sequestered over 150,000 Indigenous children, including multiple generations of Indigenous families during this time. Indigenous people were considered a problem by the Canadian government. Same language was used by the US government. One of the ways in which they were a quote unquote problem was their proximity to the natural world, to desired resources. And their perceived tendency to range across the land and claim stewardship of broad territories also were seen as disrupting settler claims to discovery. The doctrine of discovery is the basis of Canadian claims to sovereignty. The Indigenous person was viewed to be wild and savage, squatting upon the land rather than possessing it. They were likened to wild animals, or in the words of a former premier of British Columbia, beasts of the field. While at the same time they were treated as being childlike. In the early 1900s, evolutionary tropes began to gain greater purchase, and they were presented as backwards and in need of evolutionary maturation. Such derogatory views resulted in assimilative efforts directed toward breaking Indigenous ties to their territories, to their cultures. And this way, the residential school system was a primary mechanism in disconnecting Indigenous young people from home, family, community, culture, and nature, all of these elements that are crucial to the reproduction of Indigenous groups as groups. Young Indigenous men were also intended to become sedentary farmers and workers, drawing upon the natural world as resources to sustain themselves rather than seeking sustenance in harmony with the natural world. So these were deterritorializing institutions. They sought to introduce Indigenous children to a new geography defined by cordoned off fenced lands, often with barbed wires to keep them in the school grounds. Buildings that had this surveillant presence within Indigenous communities. Often they were located in Canada closer to Indigenous communities. So the school was the largest building in the community, and it looked out over the community. And the principals and staff could report to the Indian agent or even report to government other activities that were happening in community. These were ways of observing and disciplining Indigenous communities. So for this project, am I on the right slide? Yes, I am. We've reviewed about 600 testimonies from the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. These were provided by residential school survivors to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission between about 2011 and 2015 when it was doing its testimony taking. In their recollections, the survivors often describe their youth as one with nature. For those who were raised on the land, they remember chopping wood, growing crops on small plots, swimming, wandering, trapping, and other activities located in the natural surroundings. They remember the beauty of nature, the freedom they had to explore it. And often, learning language is done with nature because so much of the language references different, rocks, rivers, trees, etc. Language comes from the land. So, for example, Theodore Fontaine, who's a survivor I've worked quite a bit with on some community-based projects, who's since passed recently, but he mentions, being with his Kukum and Mishum, his grandmother and grandfather. And grandparents often played this important role of doing land-based learning with the young people, teaching them how to live in harmony with the land. Elmer Cochrane speaks more generally of the interconnection of the natural world with Anishinaabe life and language. He writes, quote, "Looking at life, we look at life in a holistic point of view. Everything is related, interrelated. I looked at four things. First, what's most important in our lives is language. Second is our land. The land means everything to us. Third is our history. And the fourth and the last one is our way of life. When I look at four of those things, I begin to see a picture. They want to completely take us out of this picture, to eliminate us, and try to make us something we could never be. I am Anishinaabe. I've always heard our elders of our past saying, you are Anishinaabe." So in his statement, he pinpoints the cultural destruction that was attempted through residential school that sought to destroy these four key relations for Anishinaabe people. Now, looking at the water stories told about residential schools, we see different themes emerge. One was of cleanliness, the way in which the schools sought to wash Indigenous children clean of their indigeneity. So upon entry to the school, Indigenous children were confronted with the abrasive power of water. School staff sought to scrub, scald, and disinfect their indigeneity away. As the survivor up top here recounts, they took me and they took us upstairs. It was called the little boys' dormitory, and they scrubbed us in there, and they used lye soap. I guess it was supposed to be purified. And then they just rubbed this thing up and down on us, and it burnt like hell. That was my first day. The water used to clean students was often too hot, sometimes too cold. Another survivor, not quoted here, mentions, quote, "And then they chopped my hair off, my long hair, threw me in a hot tub. It was scalding hot. She was angry with me because I was crying." With each such action, the life-giving capacity of water is replaced with its potential for use and violence. This is me, not the quote anymore. Where once lives were nourished and sustained in a daily life with water, now Indigenous bodies are tormented with it as water is deployed to convey the message that they are unclean, dirty, and profane. And this survivor in his testimony captures that. Says, "I started to question my own being. Why am I here? Why is a dirty, savage heathen here? What did I do?" You hear it enough times, you start to believe it. The cleansing power of water, as it's understood in Anishinaabe communities, was not available. Often tears are a very important way in which one cleanses oneself of trauma, of pain, and children often report being forbidden to cry while at residential school. I'm a survivor, sorry, how they were unable to cry. An Anishinaabe man who suffered sexual molestation at the hand of a nun, he recounts, quote, "She hit me in the groin and that really hurt. She hit me again. And she says, I'm going to keep on until you learn not to cry." And this is a lesson that stuck with him. And he refused to cry even up until the time of giving his testimony. Others recount that they learned to cry, they learned to laugh afterwards, but it took them a long time. So the school sought to control even the extent to which young people could control the water. This happens not just with tears, but also in relation to urination. So I'll get to that in a moment. The regimented cleaning within residential school not only communicated impurity, it also was an opportunity for staff members to commit crimes of sexual violence. Under the guise of cleaning students, predators frequently molested their victims. One survivor reports here, I won't read the quote, but you can see a nun is using the situation of the young men showering as a chance to commit an act of molestation. This was so frequent. I was with a survivor, Theodore Fontaine, who was quoted a while, and we were at this a commemorative display for residential schools. And they had one of the little wash basins that used to be used to clean the boys. And suddenly this elder who was beside me almost fell down. Ted almost fell down, passed out, because this was a memory of the site of where he was sexually abused as a young man in the act of cleaning. So both the children were to be cleaned and yet made to feel impure, dirty through the acts that were committed against them. Nemanis points to the hydrologics of water, including its fluidity and ability to reflect and diffract, noting its resistance to categorization and containment. Assimilative education on and around water sought to counter this hydrologic, transforming water into a resource shapeable to human will. The efforts of staff to control whether and when tears might be shed is an example of this. I also mentioned, to control when and if they could go to the washroom. Another elder I worked with, Dave, he mentions being in the cathedral and having to go to the washroom, and a nun won't allow him to go. And he's forced to, urinate in his pants at that point, and then he's punished for it and humiliated in front of his other students. So in general, the lives of Indigenous children and other young people lost their flow while incarcerated in residential school. What was once a world of watery relations, self-discovery, and interconnection became a system of obstruction, engineered passageways, and controlled movement. The bells and whistles designating when to move and when to sit tried to channel the students into tributaries from class to hall to the refectory. In the latter, the dry, hard tack and lumpy porridge they were served further symbolized a change in the water relations, as many survivors recall choking back ill-textured food, hoping to keep it down for fear of having to eat their regurgitated food should they happen to throw up. Powdered milk and eggs added to a sense of disgust felt by many students, as the rehydrated foods lacked the taste and consistency of traditional meals. A survivor testified that, quote, "There was a lot of times there I seen other students that threw up. They were forced to eat their own vomit," end of quote. Despite the recalibration of the relationship with water and the flow of Indigenous life more broadly, survivors did not feel they were resourced for a successful life in the world. And this is where we get the quote that should be up there. After all of this, being allegedly taught to have a different relationship with land, a different relationship with water, the students felt ultimately they could not reclaim their traditional ways, but also were not invited, were not welcome within to mainstream white Canadian society. So they felt in the end left with nothing. Okay, I'm gonna just talk rather than read my text here so I can get through this in a timely manner. But it's important to know that students weren't simply passive within the schools, that they found opportunities for resistance. They found opportunities to resume relationships with water as Anishinaabe people. Water was often seen as a way of escape. Here, Mary Crochane is thinking about how she could get back to her grandparents by following along the waterway, the lake in this case. Others would use rivers as a chance to escape and navigate and find their way home. And still others, one elder we spoke with recently talked about hockey, playing hockey at residential school as a way in which they reconnected with water. On the frozen water, they felt free, able to use the speed, the skill of their skating to get away from the daily lessons in self-hatred they were getting from the school. And since then, they've returned to water as a way to revive their Anishinaabe identities. So for many, the liquid they turned to after residential schools was alcohol, and many have suffered from alcohol addiction or other forms of substance abuse. One even refers to this as a soaking. I was soaked in alcohol. I drank on Main Street half my life. I still have the effects of the residential school. Everything's got to be clean. This speaker was sexually assaulted during her time at residential school, and she now showers up to 5 times a day because she can never feel clean again. But some have, been able to find their way back to water. Water is the location where one often finds medicines, and the medicines are part of the healing process. So they seek to reclaim an Anishinaabe water logic by, returning to their communities, listening to the elders, and learning these relations once again. But then comes some of the problems of modern dispossession around water. In Anishinaabe teachings, water needs to flow, should not be contained. Health and life are connected to the flow of water, but in residential school, water becomes compartmentalized and interrupted. This also occurs, though, through things like the dams that are placed in and around Lake Winnipeg and other parts of the province in order to get hydroelectric power for Canadians, particularly Manitoba. A survivor recalls how we had a good life here when we were kids. We were living in harmony with nature, and then the hydro dam was built. I remember the rapids. I remember my father crying when he couldn't hear the rapids anymore. I mean, the rapids are not just a sound that's comforting. The rapids actually speak. One can hear the rapids. The rapids have lessons to give you. So this is significant in this instance. Elder Florence Painter also gives us more lessons on the relationship with water and some of the problems with the current state of water in our province. She writes, our people were placed on lakes, rivers, and streams with the reserve system. We knew there was life because we could see the bottom. We could see the fine sand. We could swim and not worry about safety, stepping on broken glass or whatever else is at the bottom now. We would be able to drink from the streams as long as they were flowing. Now we see so much diversion. It's not natural. It's not natural to tamper with the veins of Mother Earth. People think it only impacts the Anishinaabe, but it impacts everyone. So Lake Winnipeg, which is, a massive lake. It's got a shoreline about 1,750 kilometers, but its actual drainage basin is huge, about 953,000 square kilometers. 14 Indigenous nations live around the lake, but it's currently undergoing several crises related to the damming, but also too high loading of phosphorus coming from the city of Winnipeg, coming from industrial farms, and blue-green algae is often forming on the lake. So this affects, it affects the ability to drink from the water, to use it as a clean water source. Indigenous fishers have also faced many challenges gaining traditional food sources. Elder Charlie Nelson, discusses how hard it is to regain and reclaim the stewardship views of Indigenous peoples in relation to such a body of water, since they do not see it in terms of ownership. Instead, it's a question of access. He states, accessibility of water is a human right. Once we could go to the river and drink, our human right is being polluted and affected by other humans. So this brings us to the question of, well, what happens when we think about justice, about reconciliation, through the lens of water and water relations. So if we acknowledge that residential schools sought to remove Indigenous children from their territories and to affect these water relations and enacted a form of symbiogenetic destruction, as we're calling it, interrupting their ability to become who they are, to become Anishinaabe through relations with water, what does this mean for reconciliation? Reconciliation, often in Canada, is thought of largely in terms of symbolic gestures, such as an apology, as well as compensation in terms of providing financial compensation, which survivors did receive through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, both as a lump sum payment and for payments specific to specific forms of abuse. But it does bring this question of land back, something that Indigenous activists and Indigenous youth are particularly promoting in Canada. How can you have justice without some form of returning the land or returning access to the land, as Elder Nelson would put it? So how do we restore symbiogenetic relations? Once we consider that, it opens up new possibilities for thinking about what reconciliation truly could mean in a more transformative way. So this is something that I see a lot of activism around in Indigenous communities towards promoting. It's also something the courts are starting to consider as part of a class action lawsuit, a banned class, they're calling it a banned class claim, where the collective harms of residential schools are being examined by the courts to understand, well, what sort of collective collective forms of redress can be provided for the collective harm, how residential schools harm the group. So much of the reconciliation process has been individualized up to this point. Now questions of collective reparations are coming to the fore. I'm going to conclude there, so I have some time for questions, and I'd be happy to hear questions while showing you the blue gene algae on Lake Winnipeg, which is thank you. I'm sure many of these questions
Yeah, I'm sure many of these questions are, especially about reconciliation, redress, restitution, across the border all the time, because communities are on both sides of the border. So, are there any kind of international frameworks between the United States and Canada that seek to, redress in some form in cross-border communities?
Yeah. I don't know of too much happening. I know conversations. I've heard, chiefs say, first we're going to deal with this in Canada, then we're going to deal with that imaginary line you put between our community. So in some way, they see more clear pathways to redress within the Canadian system, particularly through using class action lawsuits, using the Canadian Charter and Constitution in order to push the government towards addressing their needs, to address the injustices that have occurred. And so I think that has become, in a way, a pan-Indigenous project within Canada. But certainly there is going to come a time when these cross-border issues, when we talk about residential schools in Canada and boarding schools in the United States, they aren't entirely two separate systems. The parties from politicians, other representatives from both sides, from Canada and the United States, were often in communication with one another about their policies, about what sort of actions they felt worked, what didn't work. There's an incredible amount of sharing that went on in terms of, to the point where Canada modeled one early stage of its residential school system on the American model, then came to adapt and change as it grew. But so these conversations have been there. I haven't seen them as much in justice, but international movements like Idle No More that have started in Canada have certainly had an international impact. And I think there's a lot of conversations happening in the land back movement, and I think there's a lot of conversations happening amongst activists who are often at the forefront of these things before their leadership gets there. So I think that's where the energy will come from and drive the leadership towards considering these questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for your informative talk. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about decolonizing genocide studies, because that's something I liked in your work with, just these notions of how we view kinship, a group, and, we've had white liberal gatekeepers in this field forever. And and just the way these, as you point out, whether it's water or pipelines, as you and Jeff Benvenuto and that one article, right? These persistent techniques of destruction, right? And with the whole truth and reconciliation, it's hard to have reconciliation without truth, which is something we still struggle with in Canada, because there is a lot of performative stuff, including the government continuing to litigate against, reparations for Indigenous communities, and and then as a Canadian, the water situation with Indigenous communities is a national shame still.
Yeah, so I've retreated a little bit from that, better refine what I see as my role, and and talk about unsettling genocide studies, because I think, the decolonizing of genocide studies will happen through Indigenous scholars, and I hope, we'll see more Indigenous scholars involved in genocide studies. I think it's been a tough field for Indigenous scholars to really feel welcome in, and that's not because any of us aren't, inviting, welcoming people, but it is, as you say, a very white liberal field. And I know when we had the 2014 conference in Winnipeg, there were some sparks that flew up. I mean, where people felt that their experience was being denied by more senior scholars within the field, people who are powerful within the field, who were questioning their use of terminology, for example. So I think that needs to be Indigenous led and driven, because decolonizing is an act that is undertaken by the colonized. But a settler like myself has a role in unsettling, for trying to, expand our frames and to try to, trouble some of the ways, the habits of thinking we've gotten into within the field. So, I think we're trying to do that here by, again, thinking about how can we possibly, take into account the liveliness of the natural world within an Indigenous framework. And I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to branch out to other cases too, to unsettle the field by showing that this isn't just, even though it's most prominent, it's most clear in Indigenous communities, given the cosmologies of these communities are very much based upon their relationship with animals, waters, land, etc. But once we look at the other cases, you can see how much survivors from the Armenian genocide or from Rwanda, center these relationships with key symbionts. I mean, there's lots, we're isolating it to one key partner in co-constitution of identity, but there's many different ones, of course, that could be talked about with relation to any case. But seeing that come to prominence, I think, provides a way of, moving, I won't say indigenizing, because again, I'm non-Indigenous, and I don't claim to be grounded within an Indigenous ontology and able to lead that charge, but at least disrupting, unsettling, trying to push the field to think about the ways in which nature factors into genocide studies in a different way, because largely, in the classic works of the field, the natural world is, seen as instrumental. It's something, one might suffer genocide if you're subjected to a famine and unable to feed yourself because you no longer have food resources. There, it's a flat, non-vibrant, natural world that is being denied to humans who are centered. So I think by rethinking what a group is, who are the members of the group and who are potential members of the group, although, it can be hard for Europeans to think of, does productive work in allowing us to think about nature and genocide.
And just one follow-up question. Do you think anything's meaningful has been enacted with the, 94-point TRC in regards to things you discussed this morning?
I think I'm getting older, and I hate to dismiss, when I see the amount of effort that's been put in place by survivors to get us to this stage. I don't like to just dismiss what's happened, what's occurred. I mean, the 94 recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that have been put forward to governments have not been enacted satisfactorily. The Canadian government, provincial governments, municipal governments are failing to adequately address these recommendations. There's no doubt about that. But, the subtle changes are beginning to show. So there's been an emphasis in the recommendations, for example, on education. And now when students come into my university classroom, they know about Canada, they know about residential schools, they know about settler colonialism. This isn't new language to them anymore. And often, they're ahead of me already. They've been, engaged in some way through various social media, through groups they're part of. Well, when I say ahead of me, I mean, they're often rushing to, condemn everything. And I'm, becoming this older guy. It's like, well, let's, the apology was problematic, but the survivors won it through their action, and there were some key admissions within that apology, for example. So I'm a little less dismissive than I once was, but recognizing we have a long way to go.
Yeah, and my growing up in the education I received in Canada compared to being in British Columbia in September and my niece getting her orange shirt for September 30th and how she's aware of these things that I wasn't aware of I'd say even in university. So I agree with you there that
I stick
there's some movement.
Yeah. Oh, there was a voice from somewhere.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was thinking about your concept of symbiogenetic destruction and how that can be a way of sort of troubling some of the distinctions that I think have bound genocide studies in the past around some of these kinds of issues. But at the same time, and I guess let me say this before I get to the question. I'm a historian of Christianity in Africa, and in doing that, right, it's at least in the 19th and 20th century, there's quite a lot of emphasis in that literature on conversion, why people converted, how they converted, and so in some of my own work, for example, I got interested in how missionaries used guns in different contexts, and often in those contexts, they were sort of, you might say, kind of engaged in a on the one hand in a hunt, on the other hand in a metaphysical contest, because often the things that they were going after might be understood as manifestations of maleficent spirits or witches, or they get translated in different ways. And so in killing like a jaguar, it's not just a jaguar, right? It's an act in some sense of a metaphysical nature as well, both for the missionaries as well as for the people they were around. So, and those things are like quite ordinary, right? It's just like a part of the ordinary sort of nature of their presence, as like Europeans who have guns. In some cases, like medicine in different contexts can serve this sort of role as well. I guess in thinking about a question around that kind of concept, like the destruction of symbiotic or symbiogenetic relations, that really can open up quite a lot, not just conceptually. I come from religious studies, so like the other than human beings and so on, like that's fine for me. How does that work in like a legal framework in which, or another kind of framework in which some of those claims might possibly be leveraged, in that sense that on the one hand, the ordinariness of those, that they don't necessarily become clearly a part of an extraordinary moment of what you might call genocidal violence. And on the other hand, how that could like really, really expand what is then regarded as some form of genocidal type violence. Is that clear enough for you to respond to, or should I?
Think so, yeah.
Okay.
I hope I can. I'm probably going to run out of time with trying to say too much in answer, so maybe we can talk afterward as well. Because I think, yeah, there's several things. First off, I try not to be bound by the legal concept of genocide and to work from a sociological standpoint, because I see the law as ultimately a problematic guide, because the law has, been by nature an individualizing way of seeing the world. And, we're talking about collective. So I see my foundation as a sociologist more useful for me to try to understand what groups are. And groups and cultures are really funny things, because they're not static. They're always in movement, and these changes can happen all the times. And this is where I think Lemkin had a useful instinct, where, he's not saying that, change is a problem. Like, it's not a change if the Pueblo and Diné populations, I'm not going to say which one started weaving first, but if they share these practices amongst themselves and learn from their neighbors, and there's cultural change that occurs, I don't think Lemkin would have ever seen that as a culturally destructive act, given his definition of genocide. But rapid and forced change of a sort that has drastic impact on a key relationship, and I think that opens the question: well, what counts as a key relationship? And that is something why we're kind of focusing on primary symbionts, ones that have been part of group formation over a long period of time. So another great example from this area is the sheep cull in the 1930s in the Diné populations, where the U.S. government slaughtered all the sheep. And Weizsäcker's book on dreaming of sheep in Navajo country is a great illustration of the way in which this impacted not just people and their sources of food, but it disrupted gender relations, since women were the ones who were primarily in charge of the herd. The life of the Hogan was revolved around relationships with the sheep and goats who were all slaughtered. And then, of course, men became the ones who kept the few remaining herds, and then became, the ranchers and, keeping the livestock. I think Henry's telling me I'm done here. So, I think we need to polish a little bit too, like what we mean by a significant disruption, because cultures are often always going under subtle change all the time. So right now I'm going to revert back to Lemkin, but I think that's an area that I will keep thinking about, because once I've gone down this path, I get into the problem that groups are these amorphous entities. They're not as concise and confined as we would like them to be. Does that answer?
Yeah, I think I could. Obviously, we could talk more later. Maybe if there are other questions.
Can we extend? Yeah, I was just going to say if we're okay with time. Yeah, Andrew, you're going to be embarrassed when I say this, but honestly, every time I read something by you, every time I hear you speak, there's something really important that comes through, and I think this is a really important framework you're giving us. And it goes back to a few years ago, and I just didn't have you've given me a way to start exploring something I had thought about a few years ago, which is reading a lot of stuff on starvation and genocide, and almost nothing about, we don't even have a word for it, the forced dying of thirst and genocide, right? We don't really even have a concept of that. And you're going way beyond that. But to start to think about water in really complicated ways, I think is so important. I was struck by things like, through the residential schools, water goes from something that flows in and out of bodies, that's part of bodies, that's like almost a global circulation system, to a very external force on bodies. When you're the idea of like the scrubbing, cleaning, that kind of thing, and the denial of tears, which means the body can't put water into the world and so forth, I think is really profound work. It also makes me think of something that came up yesterday in one of the discussions of the Holocaust, and it was the issue of ashes from the crematoria in death camps being spread around everywhere in the environment, right? And we might even think there, I mean, people talk about this, that the way molecules and atoms circulate globally, they really do circulate globally, and so that somehow we're all connected to these people who were mass murdered. And I'm thinking you've done something with water that at once captures that destructive element that unifies us in this destruction, right? Because this water is still flowing, but at the same time also gives us a way, based on at least one indigenous group's conception of water, a way of rethinking that circulation. And I don't know if there's like half a question there, but the question I actually have is, I've often done work on territory and territorial reparations through territorial claims and so forth. I think what you've done is really complicated that, because a little like food versus water, territory is a static, fixed, bordered, which is a very, ends up being very subject to, I think, Western ideas about borders and control and property and so forth, even though that's not what a lot of Indigenous groups would agree with. But when you're talking about things like water flows through rivers and things like that, it's a very different kind of idea of what the world is, the physical world, and how groups relate through it. So I'm wondering if you can comment on it. Is that of any interest, or does that make any sense at all?
Yeah,
I'm probably totally incoherent because I haven't slept for 2 days.
I'm glad you heard it that way, because the one critique I always anticipate and worry about in the work is that we'll be seen as suggesting like some sort of essential relationship between a people and a natural world entity, like territory. And that's what we're actually trying to complicate. There can be no sort of blood and soil logic here that flows out of this sort of thinking. Especially from if you listen to Elder Nelson and some of the other elders speak about their relationship with that land, there's nothing prohibiting a land from, for example, having multiple relationships with multiple people. And that's interesting when you look at treaty negotiations, going back to my way long ago research, how the Indigenous nations that are located in British Columbia, there's about 13 different cultural linguistic groups at least, and they have what are called shared territories, because they recognize there's areas that can't be possessed by anyone. It has its own right. They all have a stewardship obligation, and they tried to bring this into treaty negotiation. The federal and provincial governments are like, oh, we can't deal with that. We don't know how who owns what, who licenses logging here or mining there. These sorts of questions seemed just a non-starter. So yeah, I think it raises interesting questions around restitution and compensation, but hopefully not in a way that, like you say, that sort of shows that we have to in some way acknowledge that the land itself is not just simply a flat object, but it has its own space within these discussions, or the water, or the.
Actually, as a footnote too, it's interesting that really the modern Western or European, Euro-American concept of land ownership is formulated by Locke specifically in reference to Indigenous lands in the Americas. Like that's his focal kind of example, and it's about exclusive ownership and excluding other people from access to land. So there's a lot there. Really interesting.
Forgive me, the next panel is about to start. Please continue the conversation over lunch. This is very productive, but let us thank Professor Wolford for being here.
Thank you.